the way Bergson and Whitehead, in his own terms, tried to frame those questions resulted in a theory of duration for Bergson, a theory of process, of time as operative time, as he says, as extending beyond the space-time continuum, as physicists know it, which is a way of giving positive content to time as form. I think what they try to do is reopen the question of time as a general form of experience in a way that it does not reduce time to the forms of the a priori forms of intuition in Kant's sense, for example, in a way that is more fluid, more at times more obscure too, but which eventually I think was oriented by a concern for time as form rather than time as a concept or as a category or as a kind of super phenomenon, you know, which would amount to collapsing time, by the way, with becoming. I think one way to put it would be to acknowledge that time is not becoming; it is the form of becoming. And how do you deal with the form? That's the way I read Bergson and Whitehead, and that's the way I deal with physicists, trying to extract some information that may be helpful that may, in fact, challenge us to go a little further in the way of determining the form of time.
This doesn't necessarily relate to your presentation, or I mean, it does. You mentioned Augustine, the window at Ostia.
Yeah.
What about the rupture? Benjamin's Jetztzeit, Augenblick, and Heidegger, this kind of time, you know, out of joint, this moment, you know, this rupture. How do you think about that?
Okay, I can give you a brief answer because this opens up an entirely new chapter, which I haven't opened myself for one good reason. This is the brief answer, the short answer, is that this to me is typically a question, an issue that is generally not, and for good reasons, part of the cluster of issues we associate with physical time. This is typically a question that to me arises in the perspective of the time of the subject. I mean, you need a subject to even raise the issue of rupture. Now, if you turn to nature, you're interested in becoming as, you know, part of the advance of nature, you'd have a hard time identifying moments of rupture. You know, so there are moments of change, there are thresholds crossed, there is a measure of aleatory happenings, a measure of chance, probability associated, for example, in biology with the notion of mutation. But does this amount to rupture? I mean, there's a sense of discontinuity that you may associate with this or that phenomenon, but the rupture is a little more than this. It's a discontinuity that kind of reflects upon itself, and that is operative in, I think, in a process of subjectivation. If this perspective is not introduced, then it's the problem of continuous versus discontinuous, which you could very well deal with at a physical level, but I don't think it would answer the kind of resonances you have in mind. So on that topic, I'd say Bachelard is the one who really majorly, in my sense, contributed to reframing questions in a non-Bergsonian way to accommodate contemporary science, contemporary physics, not only relativity but quantum physics as well, and kind of refocusing almost all the discussion on the what he calls the instant as being the metaphysical constitutive element of time, which is totally anti-Whiteheadian, anti-Bergsonian in some sense. And but can you recover a notion, a rich notion of rupture from there? It's not that obvious when Bachelard tries something in that direction, but I mean, rupture, you'd have to introduce a framework which is a philosophy of the subject in some sense. So otherwise, I would say nature does not experience anything like rupture. I could argue that. I mean, the first rupture is the rupture between nature and whatever is not nature. Call it culture, a subject, whatever.
Pastoral.
What's that?
The pastoral, the sense of nature as human. I mean, we're in a relationship with it. Nature doesn't exist outside of us,
sure.
but this nature, culture, the pastoral, this sort of creation of the end of nature, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah, but then you have to fit in rupture. If you're interested in rupture, and then
Yeah.
I think the way it fits in is by the human, this sense of continuity with nature and experiencing in his or her life something that is punctured by moments of rupture. And then you frame it in different way. I mean, Lacan is not Bachelard, and Bachelard is not Simone Weil. Simone Weil would say it's insinuation of grace on the plane of nature and gravity. And we discussed that yesterday. But in any case, you'd have to go beyond the pastoral view of us living in unison with nature. You'd have to introduce an element, a disruption, and I would say probably a disruption of simultaneity. So that's why Bachelard got a strong interest in Einstein, because he felt that it kind of broke with the representation of nature as a plenum of which we are part, where everything interacts. If there's no such thing as objective simultaneity, the universal interaction kind of falls apart. And then you have a sense of not rupture, but at least maybe it's the beginning of something, a sense of being insulated in your own now. And then the question of a common now becomes an issue. But this I think is not yet rupture in the sense you're suggesting.
But it seems like, to follow up on that, it seems like there's almost a political spectrum within these different theories of time, like that. I'm thinking, reacting to the brief that Bratton gave, where it's sort of showing in space this competition between sort of smooth and striated. So there's sort of a Westphalian paradigm.
That would be striated.
Yeah, it's problematized by smooth or nomadic spaces, maybe especially now with space and with ecological phenomena not being measurable. These sort of things that Virilio was very concerned about. And so as I was listening to you, I was thinking, is there something similar in the field of time studies or modeling, where sort of local time, certain versions of relativity that prevent this kind of holistic, topological modeling of time
I get your...
are on the same side of the spectrum with sort of nomadic, smooth, unmeasurable, and it's all the sort of things that deny, as you were saying, the sort of first principle that even Plato establishes there with time as measurability, sort of time that obeys the logic of the rule of number, which is sort of inherently associated with the project of sovereignty, and again, getting to sort of Westphalian notions of things. That there's an entire other series of models of time that do not obey, and that these sorts of times probably, to get back to this thing about some sort of rupture, like going to Badiou or others, it allows freedom to have some kind of unique power within that system of time, but then it gives up other things, which is sort of, again, holistic measurability, and a kind of some implicit authority as some kind of sovereign within that system. So is there a kind of, and of course that can be mapped out, it would be an oversimplification, but that can probably be mapped out onto sort of left versus right leaning tendencies. Well, I think it can within the Benjamin Bratt Deleuzian sort of version of reality that we saw. There was some of it was implicit, but it was pretty obvious. But so I wonder if we have something similar here within the sort of history of the topographical modeling of the form of time.
No, I see many points and many strands in what you just said. I mean, for one thing, there's local and global. So we seem to equate the Westphalian or striated model of space or time, for that matter, with a global, a conception which allows you to frame time or space globally and distributed places and locations and allow for a kind of immediate immediate rule or principle of commensurability between places, times, durations, and so on and so forth. So one thing we should thank Einstein for is to have refocused on the local, essentially inherently local character of time, but again, this involves a drastic reduction, and that's a limit, of course. The limitation is you end up with a very poor concept of time, which but at least this was achieved and even confirmed by general relativity, where space-time is not only where time is not only local, but space-time itself is dynamical and evolves in conformity with the changes occurring in the distribution of mass energy across space. So it's like this very fluid notion. So it's local. It confirms the locality. And on the other hand, in contemporary debates, you'll see people reproaching Einstein's relativity, including general relativity, to entertain the notion that time and space-time are kind of background objects or background structures that you need to use in order to frame local becomings. And so what they're trying to, like, who talked about loop quantum gravity? Who? No, these days someone brought it up in one of our lectures, seminars, I don't know. Anyway, someone like Rovelli, which I quoted earlier, makes a strong case about space and space-time itself not being a background structure, but something that emerges from something more, even more local, which he described as variation, or as pure becoming in a way. So what notion or what concept of measure can we introduce at that level? This is a highly complex mathematical issue, which I don't want to deal with. But you see, depending on the perspective, someone like Einstein is perceived as, as introducing locality and confirming it, or as someone who sticks to a kind of old-fashioned view of space and time as background structure, which is to be overcome, and so on and so forth. And so and another aspect, so this is the local global issue, which is difficult to handle for those reasons. I mean, it really depends on the perspective you have on different theories. And then also, what else was in your, something came to my mind listening to you. Yeah, no, fails me. Yeah, it had to do something with. Oh yeah, there you go. Yeah, that exactly. That's the point. So I don't know about left and right, and I don't know how it exactly connects with local global, which is this issue, which is, do we approach the issue of rupture or the freedom, if you like? Freedom is fine because you could apply it to Badiou as well as to Bergson. Do we approach it in naturalistic terms, if you like, which is more or less what is common to Bergson and Deleuze, for example, that is identifying the processes which allow for a degree of indetermination to insinuate itself within the mesh, the deterministic meshes, the fabric of deterministic causality? Or do we think in terms of rupture, which would involve a theory of the event, for example, and this is a totally different framework. In both cases, people want to recover a sense of rupture, but you could do that kind of by intensifying what is already virtually at work in all duration, including the duration of external physical matter, and that would be the path opened by people like Bergson. So I say it's naturalistic because it relies on an ontology where there's no decoupling, no polarization between the plane of becoming and something like a time beyond becoming. That's not how it's played out. But the other reference frames you mentioned, Badiou and others, would insist that you need a layer which is extra ontological, which involves the position of the subject as capable of enduring radical change. Radical in the sense that nature doesn't really prepare the ground for it.
That is also ontological.
Not according to Badiou.
Yes, but
In what sense?
He has a general ontology where he can locate.
Yeah, okay, in that
Straight
sense,
at
right,
it.
okay.
But it's not an ontology.
No, okay. Not in the sense of Levinas, yeah, and you probably, yeah.
In yours, is it? Is it more like Deleuze or is it more like Badiou? Because it's interesting. You have. I mean, I almost asked you that question.
According to freedom, I don't need to ground freedom in ontology. I understand freedom from obligation, and I don't understand obligation in the sense of ontology. I'm not going to expound an ontological machinery leading to obligation. It's really I'm not considering philosophy as an addendum to the large set of ontological explanations we have.
You had a question.
No, I
comment.
Again, I wanted to say one or two words because again, it was an extraordinary talk with a lot of rich sheets, and but I'm going to concentrate on because there was the first part about Bergson and Whitehead, and then the part about clocks, and you are insisting that clocks are always part of something which involves the whole world. And in the beginning, you were clarifying how Bergson and Whitehead relate to the idea of the flow.
Yeah.
But in the case of Bergson was extremely interesting because it's not the flow,
no.
But still it's retaining the past and bringing the absolutely new future. But it's not the flow. So you made it extremely clear and perfect and very rich. All the discourse about the crux was also very important, but for me, what I felt what I was more empathic with, was physics and philosophy.
Right.
Because I had the feeling that you were taking stock with personal experience.
Yes.
Discussing
very frustrating experience. Repeated frustration. Yeah.
And I liked very much when you said in the beginning, without further explanation, that it was not possible. The discussion was impossible, and I think we have to keep that point. It's important. But then you were trying to overcome it in a way. Well, you showed us the pictures of the magazines with Le Temps n'existe pas. And then you said there is something wrong because it is as if you compare with Gagarin coming back from his orbital adventure. And there is something wrong because time is not something that we are going to discover as an object somewhere. We do not expect any empirical confirmation of time, something like that. And so the claim that time doesn't exist is strange because it seems to call us to consider time as a particular thing which is or not part of the general mobilier, furniture of world, as analytic philosophers say. So totally okay with that, but then you were progressively going to the idea that time is rather a form. And another important moment was the quotation of Kalayeh pour l'analyse. And it was, I liked it very much because I remembered my youth, because I had a friend who knew that by heart.
Really?
Travailler un concept and so on. And he said it at every moment, after a lot of drinks.
The prayer of the philosopher.
So, it's a beautiful quotation, it's true. But for me, there is an ambiguity, and I wanted to submit to you that ambiguity in that whole story, because, and I'm going to tell you another story, which is about Etienne Klein. Because once I was invited by psychoanalysts to an afternoon of discussion about time, and he made a brilliant talk. But at some point of his talk...
You have to tell people who he is.
Etienne Klein, he's a physicist who also wrote a PhD in philosophy and who is quite famous. He speaks everywhere all the time.
in France.
He's a very nice guy also, I don't, because he's going to be filmed.
You're being filmed.
I consider him as a friend. He's my I met him one or two. Yeah. I think he's very clever and knows a lot of things and so on. But I remember the circumstance because he explained that according to the standard model, time is finite. It's finite in the direction of the past. There is a strict beginning of time. And he said that it raises a question, because then one asks, what did we have before
Before
this
time.
beginning of time? And he says we don't have to answer that, because there were nothing before the beginning of time. So when there is nothing, it doesn't make sense to speak about time. So I think it was a strong revelator, I don't of something which is deeply grounded in the way physicists understand things, and more generally everyone, I think, which is that time is strongly connected with ontology. So Etienne Klein was saying that when we have no ontology before being, there cannot be any time. But it goes the other way around. When we mention something as occurring in time, it makes it real. It make it exist. So we are used to think time as part of ontology, and that's why the physicist thinks that time is an object, is part of what he's competent about, because physics is the best discourse about what exists. So as time is connected with the ontology, the scientist who is going to have the final word about time has to be the scientist. And if you keep time strongly connected with ontology, you cannot escape this brutal dialogue between Einstein and Bergson, because time is part of the furniture of reality. Maybe it's also a kind of a central feature of ontology as such. So someone has to say the truth about this key feature of any ontology. And so my point is simply that you can get rid of that if you say with the Kantian tradition that time is not part of ontology. That time is a key device in our framing.
Yep. A form.
And I think that finally, when you reach to the notion of form, you come back to this. But there is an hesitation. And for someone like Canguilhem, there was also an hesitation. So I think there is a big difficulty, because if we want to keep with the idea of time as a decisive part of the heart of ontology, then we cannot escape the physicist. And even if we are varying time in any possible theoretical way, we will always ask the questions which are the questions of ontology. But if we switch to the Kantian tradition, then there are a lot of other questions. Because then, for simply speaking, what is going to be the formal structure of time, which opens up for a lot of possibilities. And this is an epistemological question, and it's not an ontological one. After all, the physicists may use that or the other one, so I just wanted to point that there is this tension, and when you are mentioning quantum gravity, it's always the same. When I read a bit because of you, thanks to you, Carlo Rovelli, and when he says that time doesn't exist, it doesn't mean that there is no mathematical framework. There is a mathematical framework, but he thinks that there is no reason to name time the continua which are involved in his mathematical machinery. So it's very different. So because you mentioned their position that we don't need to have time because we have laws, and these laws are only going to be referred to the various variables. Among them, no one is privileged. So, but still, there is a metaphysical difficulty at that point, because if we have laws, these laws have a lot of cases. Physical laws are always laws against fluctuations. Fluctuations are the various cases. Are we really able to think of these fluctuations in a non-temporal way? Which is more when we have a mathematical framework where these cases are instantiated as a point of some continuous stuff, mathematical stuff. So
Yeah, but
I think it's difficult.
Yes,
Anyway, but that's another part of the discussion. But my main point is that there is a decision to take between having the discussion about the possibilities of time, the theoretical possibilities of time. Do we have this discussion inside the connection of time with ontology or outside?
I have a short answer, and then we probably should move on. Thank you very much. It's a really good point, and I absolutely I'm in agreement. It is a decision must be made at some point, but I would like to think that the decision is not between, the choice is not between ontologizing time from the outset and as a result awaiting information from physics, ontological information for physics. And a philosopher would be in the uncomfortable position of having to generalize from the the facts of physics, and this is not very satisfying. Or adopting from the outset a kind of epistemological outlook and considering that time is a form in the sense that Kant, in the particular transcendental sense that Kant gave to this, with the immediate danger, I think, that everybody perceived, all the neo-Kantians were very conscious about, which is, well, Kant was, his epistemology or transcendental epistemology was very much indebted to a certain reading of contemporary science, of the science of his time, and so much so that the way he framed his forms owes a lot, in fact, to a certain understanding of contemporary science, of Newtonian science for that matter. If you focus on the way causality and time work together in the first critique, you realize that the form of time is here, in fact, to kind of instantiate, even where cause and effect are given in actual in experience as simultaneous, to allow you to still think of them as orders successively, as cause, first cause and after effect, according to the form of intuition. And this is a problem because it kind of blocks a richer reflection, which I alluded to yesterday in the lecture. Bachelard realized what was at stake when we think of physical causality. We should open up the whole spectrum of possibility or potentials and think of the cause not as necessarily preceding the effect in the chronological sense or only preceding it in a kind of derivative sense, but of the effect being part of a structure which is less tightly dependent on a particular intuition of time as unidimensional continuum, the kind of thing that Kant entertained when he referred to a form of intuition. So you see?
For Kant's picture, only for taking time as not part of ontology. And then you
that part of
way,
your... Yeah, okay.
But then there are a lot of ways to do that.
So I guess my point was, even if you do that, you should make sure that you're not implicitly projecting in the form certain aspects of the content, which was more or less Kalayeh's objection to Kantian epistemology.
You cannot not do that, probably.
Yes. Okay.